and unmute myself. Yes, I'm ready to go. We just said corporately or aloud the Shema, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. And I was wanting to say that keep these words I'm commanding you today in your heart. These words, we've been saying that every single week in class since we started. These words are these words, the 10 words, the 10 commandments. So we've been saying keep these words, but these are the words that we're talking about. So we're going to get to the 10 commandments this week as we look at our Disciple Fast Track Old Testament Study Manual on page 38 with the chapter keyword order and the chapter title God Sends the Law. I'm going to be reading our human condition and not my favorite mark of discipleship, but it'll do. And we're going to have story time and we're going to end with Jesus. And I'm glad that we're all here. And those of you who have to watch online because you couldn't make it this fall break week, we're glad you're here and watching online. So our human condition on page 38 says, we cannot abide chaos. We want structure. Boundaries give us a sense of security. We need order to feel we belong. And the response of the mark of discipleship on page 44 is this. Disciples keep God's law by doing it. Oh, I love that. We'll see if I can remember some of the things that I want to say tonight. I want to tell a few stories because part of our time together tonight, our thesis, I guess you could say, and we've talked about thesis statements already in our deep dive before we started. But part of it becomes that good rules are tied to good stories. So we're going to start with a story. Some of you know who I'm married to, and some of you are friends with her. Her name is Dr. Well, her name's Katie Farmer. Now it's Dr. Katie Smith. And we started dating, and we were going to go visit my sister up in Kansas City. We were not engaged yet. We were just dating. We were going to go up there, and she's going to meet my sister for the first time. And we got to Guthrie from Bethany, and I pulled over up on the side of the road and said, okay, we've driven about an hour. Now it's your turn to drive. And she was like, okay, seems weird. And so she got out of the car, we switched, and I got out of the car, we switched drivers, and she was like, okay. I said, yeah, we are going to drive every hour and stop and trade drivers because that way we'll be equally tired when we get to our destination. And she was like, okay, seems weird, but that's, I guess, how you do things. So I immediately fall asleep, and Katie drives through toll stations, just drives all the way to Olathe, which is where we're going to visit my sister at Mid-America Nazarene University. And we get to Olathe, and she wakes me up and says, hey, we're almost to your sister's house. What exit do we take in Olathe? And I say, I just flabbergasted. And I was like, what have you done? Pull over the car right now. I will drive us the rest of the way into my sister's house. And she's like, what is this person and how does he do driving? Because it's not the way that we do driving. So she pulls over. I am super mad. I do not understand how it's been humanly possible for her to drive almost 4 hours, like at one time, like without doing this. And I'm just like, I get in the car and I start driving the way to my sister's house. And it was this moment early in our dating life that I've never forgotten, because
she almost broke up with you.
I need Nicole just said she almost broke up with you.
Yeah.
I actually want to know how Katie felt, because I need to ask her. I'll probably ask her tonight when I go home, because it was such a bizarre thing for me and a bizarre thing for her, because we both had stories in our past history and how we were able to make up life that gave us the rules to go about driving. And both of us had stories that were untold in that moment that led to a absolute clash in the habits and practices about how we went about a particular way of being in the world. So we had these rules that the Smith family had and rules that the Farmer family had that were so different that in putting those rules together, it caused this insignificant clash. And we've had to work through all of those things, as many people do who get married, because your family systems have stories. And oftentimes the rules how you live by are based upon the stories that have happened to your family system. So my family had a terrible automobile accident at night where lives and limbs were lost. So my Seward family said, our rule based upon that story is that we will drive during the daytime for an hour at a time, so everyone's fresh. Also, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad was a school teacher. So our summer trips, my dad had the whole summer off. So we were able to put the golf clubs at the top of the van or the trunk. And so if we would be driving and saw a driving range, we would pull over and hit a bucket of balls. We never were in a hurry to go anywhere. We would take 3 days to drive to Colorado from Oregon because we could. We would stop and we would see the sights, and we would always stop for refreshments. We'd stop every hour. We would drive to McCall, Idaho, 2 hours from my hometown in Ontario. We would stop in Cambridge or Council. Sometimes we would stop twice on a 2-hour drive. I've never. So that's the habits and practices with my family.
Yeah. And if you want us contemplating breaking up with you, viable option.
For sure. Because I have certain habits and practices that made sense to me based upon a significant family story.
Yeah.
Katie grew up with a dad who worked in hospital administration. He only had a certain amount of days off. So if they were going to drive to Florida to go to Disney World, they would get up. I think some of the stories, like they'd get up like at midnight, put the kids to bed and start the drive. And you would drive until you could not, the Smiths, first off, we couldn't drive at night.
You stop
And
and get breakfast.
you stop and get breakfast, and you're not going to waste your days off time
Right.
in your driving, right?
Right.
And so her particular habits and practices were based upon her life story, that you get these two people together and you just have like this untold stories that belong to you, that shape how you are in the world, that give you specific rules that make sense to you.
Okay.
And then when you get out in the real world and you realize that other people don't abide by your rules, it makes it very interesting. So the Church of the Nazarene is like that. The Church of the Nazarene has two particular rules that I'm going to tell you a couple of different stories about that will hopefully make sense about these rules we're going to talk about today, these 10 rules. Because these 10 rules are tied to the story of Exodus, and they only make sense to a group of people who have been through the liberation from slavery that we talked about last week. So, Church of the Nazarene was founded in the late 1800s, early 1900s. A lot of the beginnings become Southern California, kind of on Skid Row. The church grows in the South and on the East, and in 1907 and 1908, they're going to try to figure out how are we to be one denomination. They meet in Chicago in 1907, and then in Pilot Point, Texas in 1908, to try to work the things out about how are we going to be as a denomination. What are going to be our 10 rules? What are going to be in our manual? How are we going to abide by being a people who abide by a specific set of rules? And two of those rules had specific stories. Rules only make sense in the light of the stories that make up the reason you behave in a particular way in the world. So, the Church of the Nazarene has the rule of abstinence from alcohol because of the story of where we began, with alcoholics on Skid Row in LA. So, the Church of the Nazarene's theological stance is based upon a story, not of morals, but on solidarity with those who struggle with alcohol and alcoholism. So when we only have a rule and it becomes something where we're able to say drinking is immoral, drinking is bad, we've lost the grammar of the rule itself. The rule is tied to a good story. Alcohol can ruin lives. And we are going to be people of abstinence because we're tied to a particular solidarity with those on the margins, especially with those who struggle with substance abuse. My least favorite story about this is about Christian Valderrama. Oop, this is going on YouTube. Christian, I'm guessing you'll never watch this. But Christian was a golfer at SNU. And we're playing at Kicking Bird. We played 9 holes together. And I love our international students. And he was a senior by this time. And I was like, hey man, you've been here for 4 years. What's your favorite thing about SNU? And he's like, the golf. Loves golf, right? And what's your least favorite thing about SNU? The rules. And I was like, of course. Like, what's your least favorite rule? Like the drinking one. And he's like, I've grown up drinking since I was a teenager with my friends and with my family and responsibly in moderation in Colombia. And you think we're all going to hell because we drink. And I was like, whoa. What did you say? He's like, yeah, you think we're all going to hell because we drink because you believe that drinking is immoral because I just signed a contract that I wouldn't drink to go to the school. I get kicked off the golf team, kicked out of school. And I was like, oh, Christian, I'm so sorry. We have communicated a rule to you and you've interpreted that rule as drinking is bad. You think that we are judging you, that you're going to go to hell because you're drinking. Let me tell you why. The Church of the Nazarene has never thought that drinking in moderation was immoral or sinful. It has been something that we're going to tie ourselves to a group of people who have struggled. And he's like, no one told me that. He said to me, I'll never forget, we were on 9 fairway at Kicking Bird. I have not listened to a word that has been said in 4 years of chapel because of your stance on alcohol and that you were sending me to hell because I drink with my family in Colombia. And I was just like, oh my gosh, if our rules are just words that are not tied to meaningful stories, they don't have any meaning and they don't make sense. And yet rules become commodified, fundamentalist ways of being in the world that can be used to weaponize behavior.
Right.
Second story, it's a better story. When I grew up, and probably for some of you, I'm not going to assume everyone grew up here Nazarene, but many of you did. When I grew up Nazarene, you were defined not by the grace and love you participated in. If someone were to ask you, what are your Nazarene? What do you, we would answer, well, we don't drink and we don't smoke and we don't dance. And that was the one that really, yeah.
Don't wear makeup.
Don't wear makeup. You're right.
Do.
Don't go to movies, right? Like it was like, okay, here's the best way to put your foot. This is the best way to put your foot forward to tell people you're Nazarene. Here's what I don't do. Here's what I'm not allowed to do. That was kind of how that's how I said who I was. It wasn't like I am a people of perfect love who follows after the heartbeat of John Wesley and Phineas et Brazil, who were with people on the margins and made sure to always be people of perfect love. That was never the answer that my youth pastor gave to me. Like I think and I hope my kids can probably answer that question better than I could when I was 16 years old. But I for sure knew when being Nazarene, you didn't dance. That was like a core story. And it was a core rule with no story. So Church of the Nazarene, when it was figuring itself out, on the West Coast and the South and on the East Coast dances were elaborate ballroom dances for the economic elite that the poor were not allowed to, invited to, or could ever go to. So the Nazarenes on the East Coast had a rule that said, in solidarity with the poor, just like our brothers and sisters on the West Coast have been in solidarity with the poor who have a problem with alcohol, we are going to be people who don't go to dances, even if we can, because it's exclusionary to those who are on the margins, especially the poor. So the heartbeat for both rules are the exact same. Be with those on the margins. Be with those in solidarity with those who are not invited to the party. And so we had this rule. And as the West came to the South and as the East came to the South, and we met in Chicago and we met in Texas, and the circuit rider preachers kind of began to sort of spread their gospel in the Church of the Nazarene, we had rules and lost their stories. So this rule became do not dance. That rule spread from the East Coast to the South, where square dances were part of the culture of towns, and everyone was invited to the square dance. And us dumb Nazarenes, I shouldn't have said that on the internet, didn't pay attention to the story behind the rule. And we said, we don't dance, and excluded ourselves from a community-wide gathering where the rich and the poor came together to dance. If the Church of the Nazarene would have understood the story behind the rule, they would have been hosting the dances at their church yards. underneath their tents. Because the rule was don't exclude those on the margins. Be in solidarity with those who do not have. And that's where square dances, the hope of square dances were the gospel to come together. Yet, I don't know about you, but I know people in this church who, when they had PE and it was a time to learn the square dances, they had to sit out during Debbie Bausman.
Yes, I had to.
Tell
go
us.
To the library.
Oh,
Because I was told by I had only been a Nazarene for about a few months. Because I was originally Baptist and I was told that, it was wrong to dance. So I ended up like doing a study hall during PE and I had to like write a report on something. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
the Church of the Nazarene.
I also was
Did
told not to
damage
wear
to
makeup.
you.
Yeah. Same with you. No makeup.
Oh, I didn't do that. I mean, I didn't follow those
Oh.
rules. I'm just saying they were, I was just saying they were there.
Yes.
Yeah.
You are
So-
Nazarene.
No, but I was Church of God out of Anderson,
Oh, yeah,
Indiana.
yeah,
Not
sure.
too much different.
Yeah, very similar. Yeah.
My mother never really learned to swim well because swimsuit very modest.
Mm,
And there could be no mixed bathing.
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, now church
Yeah.
camp was that way.
Yeah. No
Yeah.
mixed bathing.
At
Not
Bristol.
so-
Yeah.
But my dad was raised Jewish.
Never.
And my mom, they were sharecroppers and didn't really attend any of the churches in town because they were not really acceptable.
Mm,
So, but my family started going to church when I was about 4. But the little ladies at our church, we had a row of older, mostly widows, I think. They always dressed in black and they had the little lace-up shoes and they were just as sweet as could be. And every Sunday they'd tell me they were praying for me and happy.
Oh, I love it.
Because,
Because you
Love
often
it.
wear makeup.
and short skirts.
Yeah.
Oh,
And,
man.
and I wasn't the only one. They just kind of sighed and kept praying for us. But
Love it.
we had dances at the youth center. They were chaperoned. You had to have your hand stamped. You couldn't go in and out, stuff like that.
Mm.
And, the pastor would catch me every now and then and talk to me. So, do you still going to those dances? And I'd say, yes, sir. Mom and dad let me go. And he said, but kids go there that drink and smoke. And I say, yeah, I know. But not all of them do. And I let him think that I was one of the ones that didn't. Poor brother Beasley. But we did have all of that. And when I got married, my husband was a Nazarene preacher's kid. His dad had been a preacher growing up. And I remember Jim telling him, he said, he was talking about they didn't have a TV growing up.
Mm.
And I said, boy, y'all really were strict. And he said, no, that wasn't it. We just didn't have the money.
Mm,
There wasn't anybody coming around saying you're Nazarene, you can't watch TV.
yeah.
Well, Laura Ledbetter,
Yeah.
I think her first movie that she went and saw in the theater was Titanic.
Oh, really?
Yep.
The first movie that John saw with Kelly in college, he drove to Norman in case any Nazarenes wouldn't see.
Parking lot.
Yeah.
And we grab, yes.
Okay, let's continue.
Ticket.
So Debbie was in PE class, should have been learning the square dances. If Nazarenes understood the story behind the rule of don't leave people out. Don't be on the side of those on the margins. Be in solidarity with those who are in trouble. So we should have been making the rule as Nazarenes, host the square dances. Be part of being everyone comes and everyone has a ground floor and everyone gets to dance together and be together. Yet we excluded ourselves from a community-wide celebration because we didn't understand that rules make sense in light of context and story. And the rules we get this week, in Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, the rules for the people of God who have been liberated from slavery by Yahweh. And so you get these two forces for good being in the world. They are trying to organize themselves out of chaos into a new land to be, how are we to be in the world? How are we to act? And of course, I've been reading it every single week. So I love the Deuteronomy ones. But I think that they're both very interesting. But some of them take a little bit different ways of being in the world. But I think that the words we get in Deuteronomy 5 and 6, after the explanation of the 10 Commandments, is so important. So when the covenant is made with Moses and all of Israel, and all of these 10 words are given, you have a particular way of the explanation of those words later on. So I'm going to go through a couple of those different commandments. Then we're going to jump through chapter 5 and 6 in Deuteronomy. But I mentioned this last week, but I don't want to, I love it so much I don't want to mention, I want to mention it again. The commandment that we get in Deuteronomy 5, when we get to verse 11, and it says, "You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name." When I was growing up, do not take the Lord's God name in vain meant only to me, don't cuss. Or specifically my grandmother, the words God damn would be like, that is what that word is not, you are not to do. And so in verse 7 of Exodus 20, you have the words, "You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name." That commandment to me through the years has become the most significant commandment, because I believe it to be God coming to his people and saying, you are followers of Yahweh. Be truthful with my name in the world. Follow after Yahweh. Embody the characteristics of justice and love and compassion and grace. I've loved you, so now go love others, all the people. And when you don't do that, you are misusing the name of the Lord in the world. You are, and so you've heard this probably with Christian hypocrisy. You probably have heard that. And most likely, if you've been part of the church, you probably felt that. Am I a hypocrite? Am I saying I'm a Christian yet not following after the actions of love and grace of Jesus Christ in the world? Am I misusing the name of Christian in the world? I think a lot of the 10 commandments could just be this one commandment. Don't misuse the name of this. You know the character of Yahweh. Now, be the character of Yahweh in the world for the sake of the world. Yes, all the world. So we're going to get to the Sabbath day understanding. But after the words of the commandments are given, in Deuteronomy 6, you have this Shema, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, that we've read every week and you have it in front of you now. But if you go to Deuteronomy 6, verses 10 to the end of the chapter, you have what I find to be some of the most inspiring words of Scripture. These are words that are going to be at the heart of the people of God, at the heart of the Passover meal, when people of God are remembering who they were based upon what God has done for them in the liberation of themselves from Pharaoh and slavery in Egypt. And so you have some significant words. When you have right after the Shema, you have these words. When the Lord has brought you into the land that he swore to your ancestors, this beautiful and fine land, and when you have eaten your fill, verse 12, take care that you do not forget the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The Lord, your God, you shall fear him, you shall serve him, and by your name alone you shall swear. If you go over to verse 20, you've got this incredible little verse. When your children ask you in time to come, what is the meaning of the decrees and the statutes and ordinances that our Lord God has commanded you? Why do we follow these rules, Dad? What's the story behind these rules? Then you shall say to your children, oh, you guys, the tense is so important. We were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. The Lord displayed before our eyes great and awesome signs and wonders against Egypt, against Pharaoh and all his household. He brought us out in order to bring us in. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land that he promised an oath to our ancestors. Then the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our lasting good, so as to keep us alive, as is now the case. If we diligently observe this entire commandment before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us, we will be in the right. Because generations are going to come by and the rules are going to stand. But do you know why the rules stand? Have you passed on the story of God to know we were once Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, but now we're not? God has liberated us. So we are going to be the kind of people who, because we've been loved and saved, God is going to allow us to love and save people. He is going to allow us to be not people who make bricks and mortar and bricks without clay, but now our task is to be priestly kingdom, holy nation, rescuers of those on the margins, rescuers of those who were in trouble. You were once slaves in Egypt. I have rescued you. Now go rescue the world. Save the world. Follow after the way of being in the world, because the way of being in the world, being organized, is going to make sense because I have done something for you. Now, in gracious response, go be that for the world. And I'm going to organize you in a particular way of being to be Yahweh for the world. And just like good Nazarenes forgot to tell the stories and kept the rules, as time goes on, the rules are kept, but sometimes the story is forgotten. And we just become keepers of old rules and forgotten the stories. And when old rules are kept without stories, rules can be used as weapons, and then rules can be misused, not for character development, but for control and fear. And we can all of a sudden, Debbie has to go and skip PE. And Debbie has to go write an essay rather than learning how to dance when she should have been the one taking the hand of a stranger who may have been in a different economic state than she and danced together with them. And we miss out. So even just a few generations later, you have King Josiah finding these old scrolls and like blowing the dust off of them, right? And being like, what's this? And like finding out like, oh my God, they wouldn't have said Yahweh. They wouldn't curse like that. What have we done? We have forgotten who we are, and we have forgotten how to be in the world. And we are not following after Yahweh because we've fully forgotten what Yahweh has done for us. We're going to come back to the commandments, but we're going to jump forward to Jesus. I cheat so much in this class about rules, but I love it. So there's a couple of different stories. One is going to be in Luke 10. One's going to be in Matthew 22. So Jesus is going to be asked about the 10 commandments. In Matthew 22, it's verse 34. And so I'm going to read that briefly before we jump over to Luke 10. The 10 commandments are going to be significant. Those 10 words are going to be expounded into an uncountable number of laws that the Pharisees want to make sure that they're abiding by. Those rules become so important that for some Pharisees, perfection is way more important than love. Following after the rule that is lost, Steve, I'm really big on Steve Green right now because he preached on Sunday and that just gives me all the feels of being a student again. But he would say the understanding of the grammar behind those rules are completely lost. And so the people get kind of caught up in a religiosity following the rules that lacks a love that Jesus comes along and really is critical of. You can see that throughout scripture. Jesus kind of looking as, are these rules, is the following of these rules, are they helping you look like Yahweh, or are they hurting your ability to understand your love and then the ability to go love everyone? Yes, all the families of the earth. So in Jesus's ministry, there's two instances, one in Matthew, one in Luke, when Jesus is asking about the 10 commandments. And I'm going to read Matthew 22, verse 34. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Now, what a great question. Of course, he's going to say the commandment about not misusing the name of the Lord your God, right? Like that is going to be the one that he's going to go to. Surely he's going to pick that one, but he's got lots of great ones to choose from. He can go with Sabbath, because he's doing some interesting things in Sabbath in the Gospels. We've got some, of course, like you could choose murder. He's going to be murdered. Like, this is going to be that would have been a good one to choose, I think, it's just like, there's yeah, like they're plotting his murder. How about do not murder me? There's just there's lots of good ones for him to choose from. He does something interesting. Jesus always seems to avoid the question, and he answers this. Jesus said to them, Shema, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. Oh, my philosophical friends, isn't he used some interesting twisting of the context of his words in scripture, which is not mind, but he uses some of that early Greek influence and brings in mind here. I always find that fascinating. Then he says, this is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and prophets. Oh, you guys. He comes to get trapped and he says, Shema. And then this is obviously seen in Matthew 5, the love your neighbor as yourself, the golden rule. That is something that we see. That is not that you see that. I don't have it on me. I didn't look it up this week. But this is a verse in Leviticus. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's not made up by Jesus. That is an Old Testament commandment that we find. But I find his response even more interesting and actually more beneficial in Luke. So if you go to Luke 10, you have this story. It always happens to be lawyers. And are there any lawyers in the room? Nicole's married to one. I always love when Jeremy Miller's in class because I can get to make fun of him a little bit. But these lawyers are always asking these questions to trap him. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, what is written in the law? What do you read there? He answered, hey, now in this instance, it's not Jesus who says Shema, but it's the lawyer who answers, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. I love it. And your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you've given the right answer. Do this and you will live. So Luke 10, verse 29, one of the best verses in scripture. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? What does Jesus do? Tells a story. So he is going to, in this instance, tell this story that has been told millions of times over the last 2,000 and some years. Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near to him. When he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. And he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii gave them to the innkeeper and said, take care of him. And when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. Then asked the question, which of these three do you think was the neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. Jesus asked a question, and who is my neighbor? What does Jesus do? He tells a story. So 7 years ago, I took a sabbatical, and I've told this story in Disciple the last 7 years because I love me some Paw Patrol. Andy, who's this? Rocky. And then who's this here? Marshall. What is Marshall?
He's the fire dog.
Okay, of course. And what's Rocky?
He's like the fix-it recycling dog.
Okay. I asked for Chase and Marshall, but my friend Silas could only find we're going to Marshall. But Chase is, who's Chase?
He's a police dog.
Chase is a police dog, kind of the hero, kind of the leader. At this time, Berkeley's 11 now, but this 7 years ago. Wow. She's 4. Wow.
How the math works.
I don't know how the math works, but somehow that happens in my life. And I wanted to have the girls, because we were missing church, and so I would kind of do kind of a fun devotional for the girls. 4 and 9. Wow, now 16 and 11. And I brought out some of these characters because I love this story. And I wanted to be something that they remembered. And for the last 4 years, they listen to this story on YouTube as I tell it and watch it on YouTube with them. And I love it because stories matter and you remember stories, and rules become something that you inhabit and can be in the world if you know the good stories behind them. So there was a little character at the time in our life named Rainbow Dash, who was a My Little Pony. Anybody My Little Pony fan? You Rainbow Dash? Okay, we've got some people some kids here who would understand Rainbow Dash. And I brought out these characters, and rather than reading the story, I just decided I would play with the characters in front of me. And I had Chase, I had Marshall, I had Rainbow Dash, and I had this misfit character named Mr. Smee from the Jake and the Neverland Pirates adventures, who was kind of the bumbling idiot. And some of you are shaking your head that you know who Mr. Smee is in the world of Mr. Hook and Peter Pan. So these were all characters that mattered to the life of the girls. And so it's probably one of my favorite moments of preaching because it was just the 4 of us. We were at the breakfast table and I brought out the characters and I started the story. And I said, girls, Rainbow Dash is hurt. Berkeley's 4. Berkeley is always a woman of hyperbole and excitement. And she's like, oh no, like, what? And so Rainbow Dash is hurt. And I said, okay, I'll start out with Chase. This is Rocky, but we'll pretend that Rocky's Chase. And I said, oh, Berkeley, but here comes Chase. Chase is on the case. Chase knows the rules of right and wrong. Chase knows that if someone's hurt, what do? His whole thesis of his life is you help those who are in trouble, right? And I said, but Berkeley, Chase walked around Rainbow Dash and didn't help. And Berkeley was just appalled. She just was like, incongruent. That's exactly right. That is not congruent with what Chase should do. Chase helps. I said, honey, Chase walked around and didn't help Rainbow Dash. And she just was appalled. And then Marshall. Now, I've said this many times and I still believe it to be true. And I've actually looked it up. The number 1 most highly respected profession is a fireman. People have trouble with some police. There's people who would question our medical professionals. That was evident, obviously, through COVID. People have trouble with pastors. I mean, I would say that pastors 25 to 50 years ago would have been highly respected, but that has gone significantly down. Firemen. Like, firemen is going to do the right thing. First responders, right? They save lives. They're there when IMSA calls, right? So of course, Marshall The fire dog is going to come up right alongside of a hurt and distressed Rainbow Dash. And Berkeley's going to watch as Marshall also walks around and doesn't help. Berkeley is just incensed. 4-year-old Berkeley, like, Dad, what? Just like beside herself. Because guess what, you guys, it's easy to read these words and to not actually catch them because you've heard them so many times. But did you see that a priest and a Levite, Chase and Marshall, see the trouble and ignore the trouble? But here comes dumb old Mr. Smee from the wrong tribe, from the wrong story. And I bring up Mr. Smee and I say, Berkeley, Mr. Smees, he sees someone in need in Rainbow Dash. And he is going to help Rainbow Dash up and bandage her wounds and get on her feet and take her to the hospital, make sure she's going to get care and pay for all of it. And she's just like, she can't fathom, right? Who is this outsider who doesn't know right from wrong, who's a bumbling idiot? And I get to ask the question of my 4-year-old, who's the neighbor? And I don't think she said it at 4, but I get to say to you, the one who showed him mercy. And I just remember the moment that implicated myself in this story. Because being a Bible teacher puts you on the hook to try to be priestly kingdom, holy nation in the world. Because if I'm going to tell my 4-year-old that dumb old Mr. Smee does the right thing, what is doing the right thing? Is doing the right thing knowing the right thing? Or is doing the right thing actually doing the right thing? I implicated myself to be someone who had to help people kind of all the time, which is one of the best things to put you on the hook by being a preacher. Because you can know the rules. You can be Chase. But do you know the rules if you don't actually abide, know the story, and actually help? It was incongruent of Chase and Marshall to know they were supposed to help because they knew all the rules. The priest and the Levite knew that love was going to be the way they were supposed to be in the world. But yet the sin here is that they ignored someone in need and completely passed them by. And I say that not to be judgmental, but to almost place judgment on myself, as I oftentimes do the same, whether it's because I'm too busy or I have judgment upon the person who I think needs help. So we need rules, need to know the stories behind them. And the catch this week and in the weeks to come are going to be, I think, for some of us, knowing is doing. And I think that that was part of the lesson that day for me, for myself, and then I hope for the girls. To be someone that says, do you know the rules? Or are you in a relationship with Jesus, remembering the stories, having the Spirit within you, recognizing that your job is to be loved and now to love, yes, all the peoples. And we've mentioned Christian hypocrisy a few times in our time together, but we mentioned it tonight twice. The mark of discipleship was so simple. Disciples keep God's law by doing it. Disciples don't keep God's law by knowing it. And that's why disciple is about encounter and not just learning about the rules, but learning to be in relationship and in relationship to the stories that shape and form you to be a certain type of person who goes about love in a particular way. So this week is always important for me because we're going to revisit this story in, I don't know how many weeks, whenever we cover Luke Acts. But there's a lot going on in this story about the Samaritan here that we're going to get to later, because I didn't even tell you what a Samaritan is. We're going to get to Samaritans wave here from now. But I tell you the story of Chase and of Rocky and of Marshall and of Mr. Smee and of Rainbow Dash, because I'll never forget the feeling of doing this and then thinking, oh my goodness, I guess that I am implicating myself to be a follower of the rules, to follow after this important story. I also find it fascinating that Jesus, when asked a question, tells a story that I think still makes an impact on our life today and how we are to be in the world. So we have a few other things to accomplish, but I'm going to stop this portion of it. Thanks for watching along. I hope that you are challenged to know good rules that are based on really good stories, and that once we know those rules, we don't just know them, we actually abide by them and take them into account in the day-to-day of our lives. Thanks for watching.